April 11th, 1944, 25,000 feet above Hanover. The temperature outside was minus 37 degrees. The air was thin, the sky silent. Inside a B-17 bomber, the crew checked their oxygen masks, their hands shaking slightly, not from fear, not yet, but from the brutal cold that seeped through every layer of fabric. The intercom cracked with static as the lead navigator gave bearings, his voice calm but sharp. They were deep in German airspace now. Every man on board knew what that meant. The Luftwaffe could appear at any moment, and when it did, it would come fast, brutal, and unrelenting. But this time, something felt different. The radio operator leaned closer to his set, adjusting the frequency dials. Static, white noise. No German chatter, no orders, no screams, no contact, just absence. A strange emptiness filled the cockpit. It was not peace. It was the sound of something missing. And missing, in war, often means something worse than presence. For months, American bombers had paid the price of ambition. Long-range missions into Germany often ended in catastrophe. Without proper fighter escort all the way to the target and back, formations were torn apart by Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Gunners did what they could, but against a swarm of determined and experienced German pilots, the odds had been cruel. Smoke, fire, men disappearing into clouds, tail gunners screaming last words, bodies never recovered. The silence on the radio was not relief, it was suspicion. Because the Germans were never quiet. Their pilots were known for shouting commands mid-combat, laughing through the chaos, calling out targets to their wingmen with the confidence of hunters playing with prey. Their voices had a rhythm, a tempo of death that American operators learned to recognize, and now that rhythm was gone. That morning, when Lieutenant Harold Mason of the 100th Bomb Group looked out the left side of his formation, he didn't see the enemy. He saw vapor, trails, long, thin, high-altitude signatures weaving through the upper layers of the sky coming from the west, not from Germany, from home. He didn't realize it yet, but the shape closing in at nearly 440 miles per hour was not a thunderbolt. It was a new silhouette, sleeker, longer, with wings that cut through the sky like knives. He squinted, then smiled. It was the P51 Mustang, and everything was about to change. The Mustang didn't announce itself with volume. It arrived like a whisper that could kill. German pilots had mocked American aircraft for years. Too heavy, too slow, too clumsy in turns. They called the early Thunderbolts flying milk bottles. But this was different. The P-51 was faster than anything they had faced. It could climb with them, turn with them, and worst of all, it could follow them all the way home. Until now, German fighters could strike bombers and retreat. They knew the Americans couldn't follow. They fought with the arrogance of someone who always had an exit. The Mustang took that exit away. By April 1944, it wasn't just the bombs that terrified the Luftwaffe. It was the silence. Their radio frequencies, once full of noise, commands, and shouts, had started to go dark. Entire patrols were lost, sometimes without a single call for help. American intelligence first thought it was jamming. Then they realized the truth. German pilots were choosing silence, because every word risked detection. Every scream became a signal, and sometimes they didn't have time to speak. That silence became the soundtrack of the new air war, a war not just of machines, but of presence and absence. The Mustang didn't only escort bombers, it stalked, it hunted, it haunted. One pilot, Carl Fischer of Jagdgeschwader 3, wrote in his diary, later recovered after the war, "They came from the sun. No warning, no voice, only fire." His unit lost 7 aircraft in a single afternoon, not to bombers, to Mustangs. The B-17 crews started to notice the change. Fewer German attacks, longer stretches of quiet flight, the number of missing aircraft dropping. And in the mess halls, men whispered about what it meant. It meant the Germans were afraid. It meant the hunters were now the hunted. It meant something deep and fundamental had shifted in the skies over Europe. And for the first time, the men in the flying fortresses, the ones who had been sent into the jaws of hell again and again, started to believe they might live to see another sunrise. Not because of luck, not because of mercy, but because someone was up there now, keeping the wolves at bay. And as those wolves grew silent, a new kind of power emerged, one made not of fear, but of resolve. If this story struck something in you, leave a comment below and share what you felt. Subscribe for more untold moments from history that deserve to be remembered, not just studied. They were called the Eagles of the Reich, men with steel nerves trained from their teenage years to dominate the air. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was not just an air force. It was a fraternity of killers who had survived more skies than most would ever imagine. They were veterans of Poland, France, Britain, And the Eastern Front. They had danced with hurricanes, toyed with Spitfires, and left burning trails across the Russian steppe. They had names like Hartmann, Galland, Nowotny, legends who racked up kills like chess moves, precise and calculated. To the outside world, they were aces. To each other, they were simply professionals. And to the Allied bombers crossing into Germany every week, they were the sky's executioners. These pilots flew with a confidence that bordered on contempt. They called American formations target blocks, massive boxes of metal that moved predictably and slowly. The B-17s, though armed, were lumbering fortresses. To a well-coordinated German staffel, they were opportunities. The P-47 Thunderbolt had tried to change that equation, but it was limited, heavy, short-legged, and sluggish at altitude. It offered some protection, but only for part of the journey. Once past the Belgian frontier, the bombers were alone, and the Germans knew it. They waited. In operations rooms hidden beneath camouflaged hangars, pilots smoked cigarettes and joked about the incoming waves, not because they underestimated the enemy's courage, but because they trusted their own superiority. Their machines, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were refined instruments. The pilots who flew them knew every vibration, every tone in the engine, every limit. They fought in tight formations like predators that hunted as a pack, peeling out of the sun in disciplined strikes. When they saw a B-17 formation, they didn't see a threat. They saw a day of work. Another milk run, they said. But to them, the milk was the enemy. American bombers became known as milk bombers, a mocking term used to describe their slow, full-bellied vulnerability. It was a cruel joke, born from months of aerial domination. One German pilot described it as shooting into a herd of elephants with rifles. He was court-martialed later not for cruelty, but for drinking before a mission. For the Luftwaffe, these attacks were not random scrambles. They were orchestrated, precise, and terrifying. Some pilots specialized in frontal attacks, charging into the formation at over 300 miles per hour and breaking away just before collision. Others struck from below, using the bomber's blind spots to tear open fuselages from wing to wing. Sometimes the sky seemed filled with tracers. Sometimes the attacks came so fast, the bomber crews only had seconds to respond. In a mission over Münster, 60 bombers went up. Only 26 returned. The rest were torn apart mid-air or forced into crash landings across the continent. The Luftwaffe claimed victory. Newspapers printed the names of the top-scoring pilots, and back at their bases, ground crews painted new victory. Marks on the noses of returning fighters. They were not killing out of hate. They were killing because it was their job. The Luftwaffe had been built for total war. From the earliest days, German aviation was designed not as a support role, but as a spearhead. Dive bombers had paved the way into Poland. Fighters had cleared the skies over France. And for 4 years, their doctrine had worked. The average German fighter pilot in 1944 had over 200 flight hours in combat. By comparison, many American pilots arrived in theater with half that number, and some had never even flown over enemy territory. The Germans noticed. They watched new formations fly predictable routes, make textbook turns, and fail to adapt to surprises. So they laughed. Not out of arrogance, but out of disbelief. How could a nation with so much material wealth send such inexperienced boys into a war this brutal? One ace, Walter Schuck, recalled watching a group of American Mustangs flying in perfect formation and whispered over the radio, "They are beautiful, and they are doomed." But underneath the laughter, there was something else. A creeping sense that the war was changing. Fuel was running low. Replacement parts arrived late. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and more pilots were being sent to the ground as infantry. Training schools were shut down. Rookie German pilots were being rushed into cockpits with only weeks of instruction. Some couldn't land safely without guidance. Others froze under pressure. Even the aces began to notice. The edge was dulling. The kills still came, but the cost was rising. And then, in the middle of that delicate balance between confidence and desperation, the Americans stopped flying like prey. Reports began to surface of bombers making it deep into Germany and returning home with minimal losses. Fighter coverage seemed to last longer. Attacks were less effective. Entire Luftwaffe units failed to intercept in time. Something had shifted, but no one could explain what. Some thought the Americans had changed tactics. Others blamed radar interference. Then came a report from a surviving pilot who had barely escaped with his life. "They chased me, all the way back, past our lines, past the border. I had no fuel left. They never turned around." He was not describing thunderbolts. He was describing something new, and though he didn't know the name, he knew the feeling. It was the feeling of losing the sky. Thank you for keeping history alive with us. If you learned something new or felt the weight of this moment in time, leave your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing to help us bring more stories like this back into the light. It was subtle at first, a new silhouette against the blue canvas of the European sky. At high altitude, it looked like a mistake. Sleek, narrow wings, a bubble canopy, and an engine that didn't whine like the others. It growled. German pilots, used to spotting American aircraft from miles away, squinted, with confusion the first time they saw it. It didn't climb like a thunderbolt. It didn't roll like a lightning. It was different. They didn't know the name yet, but they would soon. The P51 Mustang had entered the war in silence, almost as an afterthought. Its early models were limited in performance, used primarily for ground attack or reconnaissance. But then, something happened that changed everything. The Americans did something few expected. They gave the Mustang a heart transplant. They replaced the underpowered Allison engine with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that made the Spitfire a legend. The result was devastating. The Mustang became faster, stronger, more agile at high altitude. Suddenly, the Americans had a machine that could match and even surpass the Luftwaffe's best, and with enough fuel to escort bombers from England to Berlin and all the way back. At 25,000 feet, speed is not just speed, it is life. Altitude is advantage. And the Mustang had both. It could climb to intercept, dive to engage, and still have the legs to chase a fleeing fighter across enemy territory. For German pilots, who had grown used to striking fast and retreating into friendly skies, this was a nightmare, because now the enemy could follow. It started with strange reports. Mustangs spotted deep inside Germany, Allied fighters appearing over targets that had never seen escorts before. A German pilot, Franz Ruhl of JG-26, radioed his base in disbelief after being intercepted near Magdeburg, far beyond what any American fighter had ever reached. They followed us from the target. They would not break off. That phrase would appear again, in debriefings, in diaries, in the last transmissions of downed pilots. They would not break off. This was not just about performance. It was about doctrine. The Mustang wasn't flying defensive patterns. It was aggressive, predatory. American squadrons like the 354th Fighter Group and the legendary 392nd, the Tuskegee Airmen, began flying what pilots called free hunts. Instead of hugging bombers, they roamed ahead or above, hunting for the Luftwaffe before it could reach the bomber stream. It was an inversion of roles. Now it was the Germans who had to look over their shoulders. The Mustang was fast, but it was also smart. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag dramatically, giving it unmatched efficiency at high speed and altitude. This design allowed it to conserve energy during flight and dominate in diving attacks. In combat, energy is everything. The Mustang kept its energy longer. That meant it could control the engagement, when to fight, when to climb, when to leave. German radar operators noticed something else. The attack patterns were changing. Mustangs came in at odd angles, at unexpected times. They were coordinated, often arriving just as Luftwaffe fighters were lining up for their runs on the bomber formations. In several missions, the Germans lost aircraft before even spotting the bombers. It became a psychological weapon. The Mustang was no longer just an escort, it was a shadow. Some Luftwaffe pilots tried to ignore it. They would say things like, "One good 109 can still take down 3 Mustangs." But soon those voices went quiet, literally. In one of the most chilling patterns of the war, German airwave activity began to drop. Allied signal intelligence teams noted the change in early 1944. Missions that once crackled with chatter from Luftwaffe, squadrons now echoed with silence. At first they assumed the Germans were encrypting communications or switching frequencies, but that wasn't it. The pilots were not speaking because they were dying. Entire German patrols were being wiped out before they could engage. Veteran squadrons returned with half their aircraft missing. Survivors landed in silence, climbed out of their cockpits in silence, walked into briefing rooms where no one spoke. The Mustang had not just disrupted the Luftwaffe's air strategy, it had pierced its spirit. And still the Americans pressed forward. Fuel drop tanks, once considered too risky, were now standard. With them, the Mustang could fly nearly 2,000 miles, more than enough to cover any bombing raid and chase down fleeing enemies afterward. Pilots began to name their aircraft with quiet pride. Old Crow, the Hun Hunter Texas, Creamer's Dream, not to boast, but to believe. Because in that cockpit, alone above the world, belief was sometimes the only weapon that kept a man alive. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about domination. One pilot, Captain William Beyer, once pursued a fleeing Focke-Wulf for over 80 miles. He could have broken off. He had fuel to return safely, but he stayed. The kill wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. He knew that every time a German pilot looked up and saw a Mustang diving from above, it planted a seed of doubt, of fear. The Luftwaffe had ruled the skies for so long that fear had become a stranger to them. Now it was back, and it spoke with a Merlin engine. If this moment in history moved you, or made you see the war from a new angle, let us know in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories that bring forgotten skies and silent frequencies back to life. From the ground, it looked like a silver flash slicing through the clouds. From the cockpit, it felt like power on command. The P51 Mustang was not just a new aircraft, it was a turning point forged in aluminum, speed, and intent. Every line on its frame served a purpose. Every note of its engine was a warning, and every pilot who sat behind its stick knew that what they were flying was something that did not just belong to the war, it was made to change it. At its heart was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a British design refined with American manufacturing power. It was not merely an upgrade, it was a rebirth. This V12, liquid-cooled engine delivered over 1,400 horsepower and transformed the Mustang into something no German pilot had seen before. It climbed faster than the Focke-Wulf. It could dive longer without losing control, and it had the stamina to fly from the English coast to Berlin and return without refueling. In aviation terms, this was no small feat. Before the Mustang, no Allied fighter could provide full cover to bomber formations deep inside Germany. Bombers were forced to fly through death traps unguarded for hundreds of miles. But with the Mustang and its external fuel tanks, that vulnerability was erased. Suddenly, the skies over Leipzig, Hamburg, and Berlin were no longer safe for the Luftwaffe. But what made the Mustang feared was not only its reach, it was its teeth. 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 3 on each wing, armed the P51 with a wall of firepower. These guns did not tap, they tore. They left trails of destruction through aluminum, steel, and flesh. A 3-second burst from a Mustang could rip apart a fuselage, shear off control surfaces, or ignite fuel tanks mid-air. And yet, it was not a reckless beast. It was precise. The Mustang's guns were harmonized, a term pilots used to describe the convergence point of all 6 weapons. At 300 yards, their fire met in a concentrated cone. If you were caught inside that cone, there was no escape. A Luftwaffe pilot once described it as a metal curtain falling from the sky. You did not dodge it, you disappeared inside it. But even more terrifying than its guns was the way it moved. The Mustang's laminar flow wing was a marvel of engineering. It gave the plane a smoother airflow across the surface, reducing drag significantly. This allowed it to maintain high speeds longer and respond faster to pilot input. In combat, that translated into something lethal: agility with endurance. It could chase, brake, roll, dive, and climb, all in one sequence, without bleeding speed the way other aircraft did. In dogfights, this mattered. Seconds mattered. Momentum mattered. The Mustang's ability to hold energy through tight maneuvers gave it dominance not just in theory, but in blood. Pilots found themselves able to dictate the fight, not just react to it. The canopy was also a revelation. Replacing the earlier framed versions, the P51D model introduced a full bubble canopy, giving pilots unmatched visibility. In combat, vision was survival. Seeing first meant striking first, and striking first meant returning home. Visibility also meant something else. It meant witnessing what they did. Mustang pilots saw the enemy shatter beneath them. They saw wings break, parachutes fail to open, fire swallow cockpits whole, and in the silence that followed a kill, many of them sat for a moment in their cockpits, gripping the throttle, breathing in the scent of fuel and sweat, and realizing what it meant to survive by making others fall. The Mustang was a masterpiece built for devastation, but it demanded something back: skill, discipline, courage. It was not forgiving. The very traits that made it superior, speed, responsiveness, power, also made it dangerous to the untrained. Many pilots crashed during takeoff. Others spun out in turns they were not ready to handle. The Mustang, like war itself, showed no mercy to the careless. But to those who understood it, it became more than a machine. It became a companion in hell. It listened, it responded, it saved lives, and in many cases it made legends. One of those legends was Major George Predatory. Credited with 26.83 aerial victories, Predatory flew his P51 Crept mighty into history. In December of 1944, on Christmas Day, he shot down 6 German aircraft in a single mission. a feat that echoed across the skies like thunder. He did not do it alone. He did it with a machine that allowed human instinct and engineering to meet in perfect synchrony. The Mustang was also a bridge. It brought together American industrial strength with British design brilliance. It brought young pilots from rural farms into the heart of the deadliest war in history. It brought hope to bomber crews who had once resigned themselves to death. And above all, it brought fear to a Luftwaffe that had never known true opposition in its own skies. As the weeks passed and the bodies of German fighters began to fall faster than they could be replaced, a strange kind of silence began to creep into enemy briefings. There were fewer jokes, fewer confident smiles, more glances at maps, more questions about fuel, more worry. Because now, it was not just the presence of the Mustang that unsettled them. It was the sound, a deep mechanical growl carried by wind and vengeance. Some German pilots said they could hear it before they saw it. Some said it reminded them of trains in the night. Others said it sounded like a hammer against steel. And some never got to describe it at all. If you felt the weight of what this machine meant in the sky, and the stories it carried with every mission, we want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and share your perspective. And if these forgotten moments of history move you like they move us, be sure to subscribe. It helps keep these voices alive. They knew it was happening, but no one wanted to say it aloud. In briefing rooms across Germany, Luftwaffe officers stared at wall maps that no longer made sense. Red lines marked Allied bombing routes that now reached untouched cities. Yellow pins showed fighter squadrons that no longer returned. In full strength, the numbers no longer aligned with the propaganda. The reports came in daily. Units decimated, leaders killed, resources destroyed. But more than anything else, something intangible was unraveling. The rhythm of dominance had broken. The Mustang had not just entered the war, it had sunk its claws into its spine. At first, the Germans believed it was just a new nuisance, another enemy fighter to observe and adapt to. But this one did not behave like the others. It was always there, in the morning sky, in the afternoon haze, in the golden hour before dusk. It came in pairs, in swarms, in silence. It struck hard, retreated fast, and came back the next day. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting a battle for supremacy. They were fighting for survival. The concept of home front in German airspace disappeared. Airfields once considered safe zones were now targets. Mustangs flying far beyond the expected escort zones began patrolling near German bases, not just to cover bombers, but to hunt. Pilots reported attacks during takeoff and landing, the most vulnerable moments of flight. Some fighters never left the ground. Strafing runs by P51s destroyed aircraft while still on the tarmac, mechanics still beneath their wings, tools still in hand. Pilots began sleeping with one eye open, not because of fear from above, but because of fear from within. The confidence that once defined the Luftwaffe was splintering. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected commanders once said, "We are not fighting pilots anymore, we are fighting a factory." And that factory had found its weapon. Entire squadrons of elite German fighters were being eliminated in single missions. The toll was not just mechanical, it was human. Aces who had survived years of war were now being shot down by American pilots who had arrived in theater just weeks earlier. It was not because the Americans were better trained, it was because their machines allowed them to make mistakes and still come out alive. German pilots had no such margin. One error in judgment meant a Mustang would be on their tail, and they would not escape. The Luftwaffe's infrastructure cracked. Fuel shortages became common. Engine maintenance was rushed or skipped. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. The once proud network of fighter wings was reduced to shadows, flying fewer missions with less experienced men. Training programs, once thorough and intense, were compressed into weeks. Young boys were handed helmets and sent skyward in machines they barely understood. One pilot, barely 19, was shot down on his first mission. He never fired a shot. His Mustang opponent never saw his face, only a trail of smoke curling into the cold sky. These stories multiplied, and with every plane that fell, the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility fell with it. Bomber crews who once counted the minutes to German fighter contact now flew missions where the skies remained eerily empty. Gunners, once locked in, constant rotation between windows now sat still. They scanned the horizon. Nothing. They adjusted their belts. Nothing. For the first time, the war felt quiet. But that quiet was not peace. It was the sound of the Luftwaffe breaking. One mission in particular marked the change in tone. On March 6, 1944, over 800 American bombers were sent to strike Berlin. It was the first daylight raid on the German capital. The Luftwaffe responded with nearly 500 fighters. The battle was ferocious, but the Mustangs were there, all the way, escorting, attacking, defending. By the end of the day, Germany had lost over 70 fighters. Many of their pilots would never return. The raid had succeeded, but more importantly, it had proven something fatal to the German command. Berlin was no longer unreachable. The war had reached the capital's doorstep, and the sound it made was a low mechanical growl at 400 miles per hour. In the days that followed, something strange happened. Luftwaffe pilots began avoiding combat. Missions were scrubbed. Orders changed. Some patrols never left the ground, citing weather or mechanical failure. But the truth was buried between the lines. Morale was collapsing. Confidence had become caution. And in a war of attrition, caution kills. A Luftwaffe technician, writing in his personal diary near the end of April, noted, "We fix what we can. They return with fewer every time. Sometimes they do not return at all. The silence in the hangars is louder than the engines now." That silence was spreading, through bases, through briefings, through the hearts of pilots who once walked like gods. And while German factories worked day and night to produce replacements, they were not replacing what mattered most, the belief that they could still win. If this chapter of the war opened your eyes to a side of history rarely told, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're finding meaning in these forgotten voices, consider subscribing. Your support brings these untold stories back into the light. It began as a whisper. At first, no one in the Allied command centers knew what to make of it. The usual noise that crackled through the airwaves during bombing missions, the clipped German commands, the warning shouts, the panic when things went wrong, started to vanish. Not gradually, not predictably. One mission would be filled with enemy transmissions. The next would feel like the sky had gone mute. Allied signal intelligence. Officers noticed it before the pilots did. Radio operators began reporting what they called silent corridors, stretches of airspace where they had previously intercepted heavy Luftwaffe chatter, now replaced with nothing but static. No coordination, no sightings, just silence. At first, commanders suspected jamming, maybe a new German tactic, but soon it became clear. This was not deliberate, this was not strategy, this was absence, and that absence had a name. Mustang. The silence was not peaceful, it was oppressive, a silence born not from calm, but from destruction. It was the vacuum left behind after voices were erased from the sky. Entire German fighter units were going dark before making contact. Pilots were being intercepted before they could speak. Communications were being cut not by radio interference but by firepower. The P51s were arriving earlier, flying higher, operating smarter. Their very presence forced Luftwaffe squadrons into hesitation. Their fuel tanks made escape difficult. Their speed made delay fatal. And so, more and more often, German pilots stopped speaking entirely, because speaking meant being found. The radio, once a tool of coordination and survival, had become a liability. Some units were instructed to minimize transmission altogether. Others switched to hand signals during flight. Orders were issued in advance and executed with prearranged maneuvers. But nothing worked forever. The Mustangs adapted. They could read formation changes, predict attack patterns, and then they would strike. The skies over Germany had become a theater of ghosts. From the ground, you could hear it. Not the sound of combat, but the lack of it. Not the booming bursts of flak or the distant wail of engines. Just wind, just emptiness. The illusion of control that once defined the Luftwaffe had evaporated, and with that came the fear. Veteran German pilots, once proud and unshaken, began to speak of it quietly, in mess halls and between missions. Not the fear of death. They had accepted that long ago. But the fear of irrelevance, of being outmatched, of fighting an enemy that no longer respected boundaries or limits. The Mustang was not just killing their comrades, it was killing their will. One report from April 1944 noted an entire Luftwaffe squadron assigned to intercept a bombing run near Kassel. Only 3 aircraft took off. 2 returned. Neither engaged the enemy. The third vanished. No radio call, no flare, nothing. The Americans never even saw them. That was the new reality. Germans disappearing into the air, swallowed not just by fire, but by fear. Even among Allied crews, the change was noticeable. Pilots and gunners spoke of missions that felt too quiet. No calls of fighters inbound. No scrambling to rotate turrets or reload belts. Just formation flying, high above the earth, waiting for an attack that never came. And when the Mustangs were spotted, They were often chasing, not escorting. They were not waiting for trouble. They were hunting it down. One bomber pilot wrote in his journal, "We used to be bait. Now we're part of the trap." This silence, this eerie absence of German voices, carried with it a weight far heavier than noise. It was the weight of collapse. It echoed across runways, briefing rooms, and barracks. It was present in every unreturned salute, in every empty seat at the debriefing table, and the silence only grew louder with time. In the small town of Jüterbog, near one of the far Luftwaffe's major airfields, local residents began noticing a change. Fewer engine roars in the morning, fewer contrails above, fewer shadows passing over their fields. The air was still, but no one felt safe. They knew what it meant. It meant the hunters were being hunted. The Mustang's psychological impact had become just as deadly as its firepower. Even when it wasn't seen, it was felt. Its presence lingered in the minds of enemy pilots, long after the fight ended, if they made it through. And that lingering presence changed behaviors. Missions were delayed, routes were shortened, engagements avoided. The Luftwaffe was still flying, but not to win. They were flying not to lose faster. And when they did take off, it was often with silence in their throats and doubt in their bones. The silence was now complete, not just in the radios, but in the war rooms, in the factories, in the air itself. If this moment made you feel the weight of history in a way numbers never could, share your reflections in the comments. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, help us keep them alive by subscribing. Every voice matters, especially the ones that were silenced. Victory in the skies came at a cost. For every Mustang that roared back across the channel, there was one that did not. For every bomber saved, a crew somewhere else was lost. And for every German fighter brought down, another American pilot added a scar to his memory that no metal could erase. The P51 Mustang was a tool of unmatched precision, but war is never surgical. Behind every sortie was a cockpit filled with frostbitten fingers, bloodshot eyes, and a mind trying to stay ahead of fear. Pilots flew in oxygen-starved silence, often for 6 hours at a time, exposed to temperatures that froze water inside their canteens and turned any mechanical failure into a death sentence. The cockpits were tight, no insulation, no comfort. At 25,000 feet, a pilot sat inches from the void, wrapped in layers of wool and leather, feeling every vibration of the engine through the seat. The cold bit into their skin. The pressure of the oxygen mask left lines on their faces. Frost formed on inside panels. They would lose sensation in their toes, their fingers, sometimes parts of their cheeks. Some returned with blackened skin. Some never returned at all. Yet they kept flying, because above all else, they knew someone was counting on them. The bomber crews below had no choice but to fly. Straight, no weaving, no escape. They depended on the Mustangs to clear the skies and hold the wolves at bay. It was more than escort. It was a pact. One broken link, and the entire chain could fall apart. In the summer of 1944, Second Lieutenant James T. McCullough of the 353rd Fighter Group suffered a cockpit canopy malfunction mid-mission. At 28,000 feet, the sliding glass froze open. The oxygen system began leaking. The cold surged in, but he stayed with the formation. He circled overhead, scanning, watching, shielding. By the time he landed, his face was swollen, lips cracked open, and 2 of his fingers had gone white from exposure. When asked why he didn't turn back, he simply said, they had no one else. Stories like his were not uncommon. Some pilots returned from missions with flak holes in their wings, blood on their boots, and nothing left in their tanks but hope. Others never had a chance to tell their story. They were last seen diving into clouds, chasing enemies too, far behind enemy lines. Their names ended up on walls and dog tags buried in snow. Robert Johnson, a name etched into the history of the Mustang, was hit 17 times over France. His aircraft was torn open. His controls were barely responsive. A German FW-190 tried to finish him off at close range but ran out of ammo. Johnson managed to bring his shattered P-47 back across the channel. He would later transition to the Mustang and fly again, because that was the mindset. You did not stop. You endured. Even the Germans, as hardened as they were, began to feel the shift. Some Luftwaffe pilots, upon capture, spoke of Mustang pilots refusing to fire on crippled aircraft or letting them bail out. Others told of Mustangs diving to protect a flaming B-17, even when outnumbered. There was brutality in the skies, but also flashes of something deeply human, a recognition that even in this arena of steel and fire, mercy had not entirely died. But war has no favorites, and even the best machines can be outmatched by fate. Weather turned many missions into Russian roulette. Visibility dropped. Ice built on wings. Engines froze mid-climb. Some aircraft vanished without a trace, their last position noted in a logbook as presumed lost in weather. A few were found decades later, buried in forested hills or trapped beneath glacier ice, skeletons still strapped in place, stories locked in silence. On the ground, families received telegrams, missing in action. No further information at this time. The war did not pause for closure, it just moved on. Behind every aircraft number was a mother, a brother, a girl who waited for a letter that would never arrive. Behind every victory, tally painted on a Mustang's nose was a sequence of moments that included pain, courage, and silence. Because that is the part of war we do not often see. Not the gunfire, not the chase, but the stillness afterward. The Mustang gave many of its pilots the edge to survive, but it did not make them invincible. Even for those who lived, the war came home with them. It came in dreams, in the way they stared too long at the sky, in the silence during dinners, in the nightmares that had no words. The roar of a Merlin engine, once a lifeline, became a ghost that followed them long after the mission ended. War machines can be retired, pilots cannot, and yet, they did it, again and again, until the air was clear, until the bombers landed, until the mission was complete. If this story resonated with something unspoken inside you, we welcome you to share it in the comments. And if you believe these personal sacrifices deserve to echo beyond the pages of forgotten history, support this project by subscribing. Every story told is another piece of humanity reclaimed from the fire. The Mustang did not win the war alone, but it became the blade of a much larger hand, one that reached across oceans, across continents, across factories that never slept. Behind every squadron of gleaming P51s was a symphony of production, logistics, and manpower that redefined the scale of modern warfare. The real story of the Mustang was not just about engineering brilliance. It was about the relentless weight of American industry bearing down on a regime that could no longer keep up. Germany had aces. America had assembly lines. The United States was producing war not in battles, but in cities. In places like Detroit, Chicago, Buffalo, and Los Angeles, smokestacks poured fire into the sky day and night. Women filled factory floors while men fought abroad. Children collected scrap metal. Farmers planted more. Trains moved faster. Ships launched by the hour. It was not just a country mobilized. It was an ecosystem reprogrammed for total victory. North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California, became one of the beating hearts of this new war machine. By 1944, it was producing a Mustang every 66 minutes. A plane that had once been a prototype was now rolling off the lines with the rhythm of clockwork. And each one was an evolution. Stronger, faster, more refined. They were numbered, tested, fueled, and flown out within hours. Pilots would often pick up their aircraft straight from the plant, fly them to England via long ferry routes, and within days be in combat over Europe. This was the tempo Germany could no longer match. By contrast, the Luftwaffe was cannibalizing its own past. Wrecked aircraft were stripped for parts. Training programs were cut short. Fuel was rationed to the point that even experienced pilots were grounded. And while the Allies flooded the skies with Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings, Germany was betting on miracle weapons and prototypes that never arrived in time. The Mustang exposed the imbalance in brutal detail. With its long range, it brought the war deep into the industrial heart of the Reich. Not just Berlin, but Hamburg, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and beyond. These were not just military targets, they were lifelines, ball-bearing factories, synthetic oil plants, rail yards. The Mustang escorted bombers straight into those arteries and ensured they made it back. Every sortie eroded the German war machine not only by fire, but by starvation. It was death by disruption. One single bombing raid on the oil refineries of Ploesti would not win the war, but dozens, escorted confidently by Mustangs, changed the tide. Fuel shortages crippled tank divisions. Aircraft sat idle on runways. Training flights were canceled. Trucks ran dry. The German war machine began to shrink from the inside, and the Mustang was always above. Its presence gave the bombers precision. Its aggression gave commanders confidence, and its reliability gave the Allies a strategic tool that could be deployed again and again without fear of attrition. This was not the war of 1942. This was not a desperate defense. It was the application of pressure with surgical consistency. The war in the air had become a war of production, of fuel, of tires and oil and oxygen tanks, and in that war, the Allies were no longer competing, they were overwhelming. One of the most staggering examples came in March 1945. In a single day, American factories produced over 100 P51 Mustangs. That same day, the Luftwaffe lost 74 fighters and reported only 28 new ones ready for combat. The math was not just unsustainable, it was lethal. But the story of the Mustang was more than just numbers. It was also about the people behind them. The women of the Willow Run plant in Michigan, nicknamed the Rosies, built parts for the Mustang with hands calloused from long hours and hearts hardened by telegrams of loss. Many had sons or husbands overseas. Some had already lost them, but they kept working. Each rivet driven into that airframe was a form of defiance, a way to say, "You will not win." It was not a single aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe. It was the collective force behind it. Every drop of fuel shipped across the Atlantic. Every mechanic who turned a wrench at 3 a.m. Every logistics officer who plotted a resupply route. Every engineer who adjusted a wing design for better airflow. Every commander who believed in long-range escort when others said it was impossible. Together, they formed a chain of effort so vast that it blurred the line between strategy and momentum. The Mustang simply gave it form, and that form was unmistakable. When German civilians saw that long nose and iconic silhouette carving through the clouds, they knew what it meant. Not just danger, not just bombs, but inevitability. It meant the Reich no longer had control of its own sky, that its borders were no longer protected by distance, that the war was no longer somewhere else. It was above their heads, and it would not leave. If this deeper look into the machine behind the machine helped you understand the true scale of what it took to win the skies, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in keeping these stories alive, not just the battles but the people who made them possible, we invite you to subscribe. This history belongs to all of us, and every voice helps carry it forward. By the spring of 1945, the sky over Europe had grown strangely quiet, not because the war had ended yet, but because one side no longer had the strength to rise. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, had become a shadow of itself. Its veterans were dead or captured, its airfields were craters, its fuel tanks were empty, and its radio frequencies, once filled with clipped orders and defiant call signs, had gone silent. Where once the horizon shimmered with formations of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, there was now only the soft hum of Allied engines echoing through the cold upper air. And among them, always present, always watching, was the unmistakable silhouette of the Mustang. It had begun as an underdog, a design created in a hurry for a war that seemed too far gone. It had evolved through necessity, sharpened by technology and empowered by sheer industrial will. But in the end, the P51 had become something more. It became a symbol of reach, of resilience, of how a free nation, fueled not just by machines but by belief, could answer tyranny with both power and precision. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe no longer existed as a fighting force. The last of its pilots were either shot down, grounded, or had taken to the air for suicide missions in a desperate attempt to slow what could no longer be stopped. The skies that had once been a brutal battleground were now wide open, unchallenged, owned. But ownership in war comes at a cost. Tens of thousands had paid that cost, some with their lives, others with their minds. Many Mustang pilots carried their victories not as trophies but as burdens. Behind every enemy aircraft they brought down was a man, often young, often afraid, doing what he had been told to do. The sky remembers them all. It remembers the first time a Mustang dove out of the sun and turned the tide of an ambush. It remembers the young American pilot who froze at altitude and still managed to bring his crew home. It remembers the German ace who saluted before bailing out, knowing he had met his match. It remembers the silence that followed, because that is what truly defines this chapter of the war. The silence after the last dogfight ended, the silence that followed the final bombing run, the silence on the radios once filled with defiance. It was not just the end of combat, it was the end of an era, and the beginning of a new world, written in contrails across a sky that no longer belonged to fear. The Mustang did not just help win the war, it changed the war. It changed how battles were fought, how missions were planned, how nations saw distance and reach. It was the answer to a question the Allies had been asking since 1939. How do you stop an enemy that seems untouchable? You build something that never stops flying, and you fill it with people who never stop believing. So when the last gun fell silent and the last aircraft touched down, those who looked up at the sky knew that something had shifted forever. What had once been dominated by tyranny was now protected by sacrifice. The Mustang was more than a machine. It was a message that no matter how dark the sky becomes, there is always something capable of rising through it, something faster, stronger, unrelenting. And in 1945, when the world looked up, that message flew with the sound of 650 caliber guns, a Rolls-Royce engine, and the American star painted on its wings. Thank you for being with us through this journey, through fear, fire, silence, and flight. If this story moved you, taught you something new, or helped you see the war through a more human lens, we invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, just like theirs did. Subscribe if you want to keep history alive, not in textbooks but in stories that breathe, bleed, and echo. And when the screen fades, another chapter is waiting. Click on the next video. Let the sky speak again.